This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, I want to share with you one more original thought. It's a challenging idea. You could think about it, but it's a new idea. We know that Kinna Chafhei, according to some, an earlier Kinna as well, mourns the destruction of the Crusades. We know that we also commemorate the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av, and there's a disaster that we make no mention of on Tisha B'Av, and that is the Chmielnicki pogroms. And that's the question of Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Igros Moshe. Why don't we say anything about 1648, 1649? And yet we talk a lot about the Crusades, and we talk a lot about the Holocaust. Rav Moshe has a wondrous chiddush. Rav Moshe says that not all Jewish tragedy is sourced in the Churban. Only tragedy that comes about as a result of the prevailing government, could we say, because the Romans took away our Melucha and took control as a world power, so now all disaster that comes through the government is an outgrowth of Churban Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, says Rav Moshe, the Crusades that came through the Holy Roman Empire, that's a direct result of the Churban. But not so the Chmielnicki pogroms. The Chmielnicki pogroms was not the Ukrainian government, it was the rebels against the government. The Cossacks were rebels against the prevailing government. That's not a result of Churban Beis HaMikdash. So I have the following interesting question on this. Why couldn't you say the same thing about the Crusades? Were the Crusades really acting on behalf of the government? Was this an officially licensed government program to go and to massacre Jewish communities en route to Jerusalem? They just wanted to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim infidels. But part of that program was not to ransack and murder and violate Jewish cities in Europe. By the way, that was done by many rebels and many ruffians and people who were just peasants. In fact, many of the governors were against the Crusades because once these ruffians finished ransacking the Jewish cities, they came after the governor and the king. So utilizing Rav Moshe's svara, why would we mourn the Crusades on Tisha B'Av? The Crusades should be more like the Chmielnicki pogroms, which you could argue was not part of the regularly scheduled government programming. So I think there's another very important part of the Crusades that it's worthwhile to bear in mind. The Sma recorded, and this is brought in the Sefer Seder HaDoros, that during the times of the Crusades, the region of Worms, suffered a greater fate than any other community in Europe. And the Sma says that phenomenon did not go unnoticed. And the reason why that happened is because the Crusades created a very great kitrug on Klal Yisrael. And that kitrug was how many Christians were willing to give up the comfort of their home to go and liberate Jerusalem. And yet when Ezra HaSofer returned to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash and he sent word to the community of Worms to join them, they said, nah, you guys go up to the big Jerusalem in Israel and we'll stay here in Worms in our little Jerusalem. And that created a great kitrug in Shemayim. Here the Gentiles are willing to leave the diaspora and liberate Jerusalem, and the Jews had to stay in Worms. They couldn't leave their homes behind. How could it be that the Christians don't belong in Israel in the first place? They're willing to give up their homes, and the Jews are not. And because of that, during the times of the Crusades, the community of Worms suffered the greatest fate. And I believe this is a big part of why we mourn the Crusades on Tisha B'Av. It's not just because somehow it's connected to the Churban. It's not just because what the Crusaders perpetrated, they did as a continuation of the Holy Roman Holy Roman Empire. No. There's a much more basic Jewish lesson over here. That the reason why the Churban happened is the exact same reason why the Crusades happened. Why did the Churban happen? Because we weren't interested in Eretz Yisrael. When God was going to take us into Eretz Yisrael, the Meraglim came and said, you know what? The pizza in Eretz Yisrael is not as good as it is in New York. The fruits in Israel, they're not as good as it is in Mitzrayim. So you know what? I think we should stay in Mitzrayim. The reason for the Churban is we didn't want to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's the same reason for the Crusades. The Crusaders wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael, and we didn't. So it's not just we're mourning Jewish tragedy. It's Churban, deja vu all over again. It's the exact same chait as the chait hameraglim. What precipitated the Crusades is what precipitated Churban Beis Hamikdash. You know, the Nesivos writes, V'dimasa alecheya. The Nesivos says that in Eicha we say the tear is on her cheek. Says the Nesivos, what does it mean the tear is on her cheek? When the Meraglim came and they told Klal Yisrael, nah, you don't want to go into the land of Israel. It's a bad land. So the Jewish people cried. They didn't want to go in. They thought it was a bad land. Says the Nesivos, that crying, that tear is still on our cheek. We still don't want to go back. We have every excuse in the world not to go back. This city is better. That city is better. It's better in the north, in the south. The same way the Meraglim caused us not to go back, we're still guilty of the exact same allegation. The same story all over again. When you read that kinna about the Crusades, we're not just mourning Jewish tragedy, we're mourning Jewish shortcoming. Our apathy toward Eretz Yisrael is the same that it was 1,000 years ago, and it's the same way today. Nothing has changed. We still don't want to move there, we still don't want to go there, we still don't want to retire there. Whatever excuse in the world, believe me, the Meraglim were successful in making sure that we're still boicha b'chia shachina. That's the kinna of the Crusades. We had every opportunity to go back and we said, no, Worms, it's so nice in Germany. Those Germans, they just love us so much. Germany and the Jewish people together forever in love and harmony. We Jews, we just love Germania shel Edoim, the Rhineland. And that is the verdict of Jewish history. And that's a frightening reason. So it comes out, Marv Rabbi Sai, that the same explanation we gave for the burning of the Shas, it's not that we're mourning Jewish tragedy. We're mourning the cause of it, sinas chinam. The same thing with the Crusades. We're not mourning the tragedy of the Crusades. We're mourning what brought us into that terrible predicament. And that is why the kinnos ends with the 10 Sion kinnos. Because those are not really kinnos. They're more piyutim about the love of Eretz Yisrael. But they're not mournful at all. But the answer is the end of the kinna is supposed to give us some kind of reality change and check. That we need to change our attitude toward Eretz Yisrael. As the Kloisenberger Rebbe would say, before Klal Yisrael came to Eretz Yisrael, Boyu Cheshbain. They had to conquer Cheshbain, which he interpreted to mean they had to overcome all the various Cheshbainos that people have. Why every other place in the world is better. Marv Rabbi Sai, we hope that through the great day of Tisha B'Av, which on the one hand is the most mournful day of the year, but it's also a day of Yom Tif. Like Rabbi Yonasan Eibishitz writes, Chazoin stands for Chatzi, Zam, V'Chatzi, Nechama. Yes, it's partially a day of anger, but it's also a partial day of consolation. Because if we take these lessons to heart, we'll be able to reverse course and Be'ezus Hashem change Tisha B'Av into the full Yom Tov it was intended to be. Shvi Zoicha, Hashivenu, Hashem Elecha V'Nashuva. Have an easy fast. Bracha V'Atzlacha. Kol Tov.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.